August 1945. The Pacific sun burns white over a field of dust somewhere in the Philippines. The war is over, but the air still carries the smell of iron and smoke. A convoy of trucks grinds to a halt beside rows of barbed wire and wooden barracks. Inside the trucks, silent, gaunt faces of men who once fought to the last breath for the emperor. Japanese soldiers, now prisoners of war, step down one by one, clutching their torn caps, unsure whether they will face mercy or vengeance. They had heard the stories that Americans tortured, starved, and executed their captives, that surrender meant dishonor and death. Yet what greets them is not a rifle butt or a shouted order, but a soldier offering water, cold, clear water. Another lays out bowls of rice and bread. The men stare, hesitant, unable to believe that this kindness is real. For the first time, they see their enemies not as demons, but as men, and that realization, quiet, fragile, and human, is where our story begins. Before the war ended in 1945, few conflicts in modern history had burned with such intensity and hatred as the one fought across the Pacific. From the steaming jungles of New Guinea to the black sands of Iwo Jima, Japanese and American soldiers met in battles where surrender was almost unthinkable. Every inch of land had to be taken by fire, blood, and will. For the Japanese, raised under the ancient code of Bushido, death in battle was a form of spiritual duty. The emperor was divine, and to lay down one's life for him was the highest honor. But to surrender, to live after defeat, was to bring shame upon one's family and nation. Japanese military propaganda reinforced this belief relentlessly, portraying American soldiers as brutal savages who slaughtered prisoners and desecrated the dead. For the average Japanese soldier, capture was not survival. It was humiliation beyond redemption. Across the ocean, the Americans saw the enemy through their own lens. Fierce, fanatical, and merciless. The atrocities at Nanking, the Bataan Death March, and the kamikaze attacks left deep scars on the American psyche. Newspapers printed headlines that dehumanized the Japanese as monsters. Every encounter on the battlefield seemed to confirm it. The war had stripped both sides of humanity in each other's eyes. By 1944, the Pacific Campaign had become a grinding, attritional war. On islands like Saipan and Peleliu, entire Japanese garrisons chose suicide over capture. In one chilling instance on Saipan, more than 1,000 civilians, men, women, and children, threw themselves from cliffs rather than surrender to American troops. For U.S. soldiers witnessing these scenes, it was a vision of war that defied reason. They faced an enemy who would rather die than live under American mercy. Yet beneath the hatred, something quiet began to shift. As the Allied forces moved closer to Japan's mainland, the number of Japanese captives slowly increased. Some wounded, some disillusioned, some simply too exhausted to fight. For the first time, American officers were confronted with the responsibility of handling thousands of prisoners whose culture considered capture worse than death. At the same time, American policy was evolving. The Geneva Convention of 1929 laid out standards for humane treatment of prisoners of war: food, shelter, medical care, and protection from violence. Despite the rage felt after Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Army leadership understood that how they treated these captives would reflect not only on military discipline, but on the moral standing of the United States itself. It was not just a question of mercy. It was a test of what kind of civilization America claimed to defend. In the closing months of the war, as U.S. forces captured Okinawa and prepared for the possible invasion of Japan, propaganda on both sides still painted the enemy as inhuman. But the moment atomic fire fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, everything changed. Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, marked the collapse of an empire that had fought with unyielding conviction. Yet, for the men on the ground, both conquerors and conquered, The war did not end overnight. It faded slowly, in confusion, in hunger, in silence. For the first time, thousands of Japanese soldiers laid down their weapons and faced the unimaginable. Life as prisoners of the Americans. Many expected immediate execution. Some wept silently as they handed over their rifles. Others refused to meet the gaze of their captors, believing that even eye contact was dishonor. They were no longer warriors. They were broken men in an unfamiliar world. What awaited them next would defy everything they had been taught about their enemies. When Japan officially surrendered aboard the USS Missouri on September 1945, the world entered a strange and fragile peace. But scattered across the Pacific were hundreds of thousands of Japanese soldiers. Some hidden in jungles, others stranded on remote islands, and many simply waiting, unsure of what surrender really meant. For years, they had been told that capture meant torture, starvation, and disgrace. Now, with their empire shattered, those same men faced an unthinkable order. Lay down your arms. Obey the Americans. The United States faced a massive logistical challenge. In the months after Japan's surrender, more than 600,000 Japanese soldiers became prisoners under Allied control. Camps were established in places like the Philippines, Guam, Okinawa, and on American soil itself, in Wisconsin, New Mexico, and Texas. Some were transported across the ocean aboard Liberty ships, still wearing their faded khaki uniforms, staring out at the endless water that separated them from their homeland. For most, the journey began with fear. At every checkpoint, they waited for punishment that never came. American guards searched them, cataloged their names, and handed them rations. Instead of beatings, they were given food: white bread, coffee, cigarettes. Some prisoners hesitated to eat, believing the kindness was a cruel trick. But hunger overcame suspicion, and slowly, the myth began to crack. The American command was determined to uphold the Geneva Convention. Each camp was organized with military precision: barracks for sleeping, infirmaries for the wounded, and even libraries and sports fields. The U.S. Army's Office of the Provost Marshal General issued strict orders. Japanese prisoners will be treated humanely, regardless of conduct or belief. For many guards, these words were more than policy. They were a quiet statement of principle in a world just emerging from savagery. In some camps, captured Japanese doctors were allowed to assist in medical care. Interpreters worked tirelessly to translate orders and reassure the prisoners. At Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, some POWs were astonished to find that they were allowed to write letters home. Their first contact with Japan since being captured. They wrote hesitantly, confessing disbelief at the generosity of their captors. One letter recorded by U.S. censors read simply, "I expected death. Instead, they gave me life." But not all prisoners adjusted easily. Many lived with deep guilt. Their code had not prepared them for kindness. It had prepared them only for victory or death. Some refused to eat, attempting suicide rather than accept what they saw as dishonorable mercy. American chaplains and doctors intervened, confused by the spiritual conflict consuming their captives. Over time, however, even the most stoic began to soften. The rhythm of meals, work, and rest began to restore something human, a fragile sense of dignity. On the American side, attitudes were also shifting. Guards who had fought in the Pacific, men who had seen the worst of the war, found themselves sharing cigarettes and stories with those they once called the enemy. One U.S. sergeant later wrote in his diary, "They're not the men I fought. They're boys who were told the same lies I was." Slowly, the distance between captor and captive began to narrow. By late 1945, camps across the Pacific had become small worlds of paradox, surrounded by barbed wire, yet governed by unexpected compassion. The Americans saw their role not as conquerors, but as custodians of peace. Each bowl of rice, each medical treatment, each gesture of decency sent a message that reached far beyond the fences. The war had ended, but humanity had not. The transformation was only beginning. Soon, those Japanese soldiers would experience acts of kindness so profound that they would question everything they had ever believed about honor, mercy, and the meaning of victory. In the stillness that followed surrender, the camps became laboratories of human emotion. Men who had once shouted battle cries across the Pacific now lived behind fences, stripped of rank and purpose. But what they discovered there was something they had not known existed in war: compassion. For many Japanese POWs, the first shock was food. Not just its abundance, but its variety. Bread, butter, coffee. Things unimaginable in the ration-starved empire they had come from. Some stared in disbelief as American cooks handed them trays. "Eat," the guards would say, and the prisoners hesitated, expecting poison or mockery. Yet the taste was real, warm, ordinary, and strangely comforting. It was the first time in years they had eaten without fear. Then came medical care. Wounded soldiers, some with festering bullet wounds, others suffering from malaria, were treated by U.S. Army doctors who had once faced the same weapons. American medics changed bandages, injected medicine, even joked gently through interpreters. One Japanese corporal, his arm amputated after Okinawa, wept openly when an American nurse adjusted his blanket and whispered, "You'll be fine now." For men trained to see kindness as weakness, such moments carried unbearable weight. Work details were another revelation. Prisoners were allowed to help build, farm, and repair, not as slaves, but as paid laborers. Their wages, small but symbolic, were recorded in camp ledgers and later given as savings upon release. To men who had lost everything, this small token of respect struck deep. They were still prisoners, but they were no longer treated as beasts. In many camps, recreation was encouraged. Baseball games were organized. Music instruments appeared. Some POWs formed orchestras and choirs, singing old Japanese songs as American guards listened from a distance. Slowly, suspicion turned into curiosity, and curiosity into cautious friendship. The human heart, long trained for hate, was learning to trust again. For the Americans, it was a different kind of awakening. American soldiers had entered the war with fury in their veins. Pearl Harbor, Bataan, and the kamikaze raids had forged a deep bitterness that few could shake. But standing face to face with captured Japanese soldiers, hungry, sick, frightened, something began to unravel inside them. The enemy stopped being a symbol and became a man. U.S. Army training emphasized discipline and restraint. Guarding POWs was not a privilege. It was a test of character. Officers reminded their men that the world was watching, and that America's strength lay not just in its weapons, but in its values. Even so, many guards were young and carried scars of their own. They had seen friends die in brutal conditions. Yet, when they handed food through the wire, they found themselves doing so with unexpected gentleness. At Camp McCoy, reports show that guards often shared cigarettes with Japanese POWs after duty hours, a quiet gesture that blurred the line between victory and humanity. Some even taught them English, exchanged jokes, or helped them write letters home. The War Department allowed supervised recreation precisely for this reason, to maintain order through respect. The result was astonishingly effective. Violence within the camps was rare. Morale remained high, and discipline stayed firm. Not through fear, but through mutual recognition. Behind this policy was a deeper calculation. American commanders understood that how they treated Japanese POWs would ripple into the post-war world. Each prisoner who returned to Japan would carry a story of how America behaved in victory. It was psychological diplomacy wrapped in decency. But for most soldiers and guards, it wasn't strategy. It was conscience. After years of killing, they found themselves longing for normalcy, for some small redemption. Treating prisoners humanely gave them a way to feel human again. It allowed them to believe that war had not completely stripped them of compassion. And for both sides, that realization that kindness could exist between enemies became the quietest revolution of all. The next layer of this story digs even deeper, into culture, morality, and power, and how the ideals of Bushido met the Western code of humanity inside those camps. The greatest shock for many Japanese prisoners was not the barbed wire or the defeat. It was mercy. In their world, shaped by centuries of warrior tradition, mercy was not expected from an enemy. Under Bushido, the samurai code that had evolved into modern Japanese military ethos, compassion toward the defeated was seen as weakness. To surrender was to lose honor. To show kindness to those who surrendered was unnecessary. In that system, respect was earned only through sacrifice, obedience, and death. But the Americans operated under a completely different moral compass, one rooted in Western ideals of justice, Christianity, and human rights. They believed that even in war there were rules, and that those rules defined civilization. The Geneva Convention was more than paper. It was principle. It separated soldier from murderer, army from mob. When the two systems collided in the aftermath of Japan's surrender, the result was both confusing and transformative. Japanese soldiers who had been taught to despise weakness now faced an enemy who treated weakness with compassion. They expected humiliation. Instead, they were given dignity. This inversion of moral order struck deeply into their sense of self. For many, it was the first time they questioned the absolute authority of their indoctrination. Accounts from Camp O'Donnell in the Philippines describe scenes that felt almost biblical. American doctors treated wounded Japanese prisoners in the same tents as their own men. Chaplains held non-denominational prayers, inviting both sides to listen. A few Japanese prisoners attended quietly, uncertain, curious. One interpreter later recalled a soldier whispering, "Why would they pray for us?" The question itself revealed the depth of the moral dissonance at play. In time, this moral shock began to erode the old certainties. The prisoners who survived would carry home not just memories of defeat, but an understanding that compassion could coexist with strength. That revelation, subtle yet profound, would become one of the most enduring moral legacies of the Pacific War. As the war ended, Washington faced the monumental task of reconstructing Japan. The goal was clear: prevent future militarism by transforming Japan into a stable, democratic ally. And that transformation began not in Tokyo, but in the camps. American psychologists, cultural advisors, and intelligence officers recognized that Japanese POWs were not just prisoners. They were future messengers. Each man who returned home would carry a story that could influence public opinion in the shattered empire. Treat them cruelly and resentment would fester. Treat them fairly, and they might become voices for reconciliation. This logic drove what came to be known as re-education through humanity. In camps across the Pacific and on U.S. soil, educational programs were quietly introduced. POWs were given access to newspapers, English language classes, and even discussions about democracy and post-war reconstruction. They read about labor rights, freedom of speech, and international cooperation, ideas once labeled as dangerous by Imperial Japan. The goal was subtle: to replace the cult of death with the dignity of life. At the same time, the humane treatment of Japanese POWs served as powerful propaganda against the defeated Axis ideology. It demonstrated that Allied victory was not just military, it was moral. Every bowl of rice, every medical operation, every gesture of fairness sent a message to the world that democracy, even in triumph, could remain compassionate. Behind this, There was another layer of strategy. American officials knew that word of these conditions would eventually reach Japan through letters and repatriated prisoners. In a nation devastated by bombings and starvation, the tales of American mercy carried immense psychological weight. They softened hostility, built curiosity, and laid the first emotional foundations for the post-war alliance that would define East Asia for decades. Of course, not all acts were purely calculated. Many Americans simply followed their conscience. But history often moves through both hearts and policies. And in the quiet order of those POW camps, both forces aligned perfectly. Mercy became both a moral act and a weapon of peace. By late 1946, thousands of Japanese prisoners had begun to internalize these lessons. They no longer viewed Americans as faceless enemies, but as complex, disciplined, even admirable people. And as they prepared for repatriation, many wrote letters expressing gratitude and disbelief, messages that would astonish those waiting back home. But before that return, there came a moment of profound human transformation. The turning point inside the camps, when fear finally gave way to trust. It began, as all revolutions do, with something small, an act of kindness too powerful to ignore. August 15, 1945. At precisely noon in Tokyo, millions of people gathered around radios, in homes, factories, schools, and shattered streets. The air was still, the tension unbearable. Then, for the first time in history, they heard the voice of the emperor. Soft, distant, speaking in an archaic, poetic Japanese few fully understood. But everyone grasped the meaning. The empire had accepted defeat. The broadcast was surreal. No one had ever heard Emperor Hirohito's voice before. Many wept. Some fell to their knees. Others stared in silence, refusing to believe it. He spoke of enduring the unendurable, of saving the Japanese people from total annihilation. He did not say the word surrender, but every heart knew. Across the nation, chaos and grief rippled like aftershocks. Some officers committed suicide, unable to live with the shame. Others destroyed documents, burned flags, and buried swords. Civilians wondered what the occupation would bring: fear, humiliation, or hope. In that one moment, a divine emperor became a mortal man. The illusion of invincibility shattered. Yet, within the silence that followed, something unexpected emerged. Relief. The bombs would stop falling. The young would no longer die. For the soldiers returning home, their uniforms torn, their eyes hollow, Japan was no longer the nation they had left. Cities had turned to ash. Families were gone. But beneath the ruins, life began to stir again. Fragile, stubborn, and human. The voice that ended the war was not one of conquest or vengeance. It was weary, trembling, yet resolute. A reminder that even the proudest empires can kneel before the unbearable weight of loss. And as Japan bowed to its fate, the world stood still, listening to the echo of a voice that changed history forever. When the dust finally settled and the thunder of war faded, Japan stood on the edge of silence. Cities once alive with neon dreams were now oceans of rubble. Hiroshima and Nagasaki had turned into open wounds, silent witnesses to the unimaginable. But amid that silence, something remarkable began to happen. American troops marched through the streets not as conquerors, but as caretakers. Instead of cruelty, they brought food, medicine, and rebuilding plans. The people who had once been enemies began to look each other in the eyes, cautiously at first, then with growing trust. Children who had been taught to fear Americans as monsters now chased their jeeps, laughing and waving. The hatred of war began to melt into the humanity of shared survival. General Douglas MacArthur, tall and composed, became a towering figure in Japan's rebirth. Under his supervision, The U.S. occupation began not with punishment, but with transformation. The ancient empire was forced to confront its past, its militarism, its illusions of divine destiny, and step into something new: democracy. The Japanese constitution was rewritten, women gained the right to vote, and the emperor, once worshipped as a god, became a symbol of peace. Factories that once forged weapons now built radios, bicycles, and dreams. Children returned to school. Farmers planted rice in ashes. Slowly, Japan began to breathe again. But rebuilding was not just about walls and roads. It was about identity. Who were they now, these people who had fought for a lost empire? The answer came not from generals or politicians, but from ordinary citizens. Mothers, workers, teachers. They became the architects of a new Japan. In the shadow of defeat, they discovered a strange, powerful truth. The end of war was not their downfall. It was their rebirth. For every nation that rises again, there are ghosts that never rest. The war had taken more than land or pride. It had taken souls. Every home in Japan carried a photograph framed in black ribbon. Every mother had a son who never came home. The silence of the islands was not peace. It was mourning. In the evenings, widows gathered near the riverbanks, holding faded letters written in trembling hands, promises of return that were never kept. They spoke softly, as if afraid to disturb the dead. In their eyes lived both grief and grace, the quiet acceptance that love could survive even when bodies could not. American soldiers, too, carried their own scars. Some had seen the faces of the very men they had fought against, now frail and starving in prison camps. Many confessed in their diaries that they no longer knew what victory meant. They had won the war, yet lost something of their humanity in the process. Doctors who worked in Hiroshima described horrors beyond imagination: skin hanging in tatters, shadows of people burned into walls, the marks of a power too great for mercy. This, one American medic wrote, is not triumph. This is what happens when man forgets God. And yet, in those ruins, acts of compassion bloomed like fragile flowers through concrete. A U.S. nurse held a dying child in her arms. A Japanese farmer shared rice with an American patrol. Humanity, battered and broken, still refused to die. The war had shown the world its own reflection: raw, brutal, and unrecognizable. And when the nations finally looked into that mirror, they understood. No side had truly won. The real victory would be found only in the courage to rebuild, to forgive, and to remember. In the years that followed, the barbed wire fences came down. The prisoners went home, thinner, quieter, but alive. Some carried letters of thanks from American officers. Others carried memories they could never speak of again. Yet one truth endured: kindness had crossed the boundaries that war could not. Former enemies would meet again, not on battlefields, but in classrooms, trade offices, and memorial sites. The United States would help rebuild Japan's cities, factories, and even its spirit. Within a decade, the two nations once locked in savage combat became allies, proof that compassion could succeed where conquest had failed. Many Japanese veterans later confessed in memoirs that what broke them was not defeat, but mercy. "They treated us like men," one wrote, "and that shamed me more than losing." That shame, transformed into respect, became the foundation for something greater: understanding. Today, when survivors of both sides meet, they no longer speak of hatred. They speak of survival, of hunger, of moments when humanity flickered even in the darkest nights. They remind younger generations that war may twist the human heart, but it cannot erase its capacity for empathy. Because kindness, once shown, outlives the sound of guns. It survives across oceans and generations, in stories whispered to grandchildren who may never see war but must understand its cost. And so, The legacy of those Japanese prisoners, who could not believe the mercy they received, lives on as a quiet warning and a powerful hope. That in the end, the greatest victory is not to destroy your enemy, but to make him human again. The camera pans upward over the same Pacific sky, now peaceful, silent, infinite. The war has ended, but its lesson endures.